Out of all the stars and galaxies, somehow a clump of matter on a small planet started asking questions about itself. That's what intelligence is, the universe becoming self-aware. I'm Danielle Perzik. I'm a cognitive scientist who spent my PhD studying how intelligence evolves and develops. And now I'm part of Amazon's experimental AGI lab where we're trying to build it. Here's the thing. Everything you think you know about intelligence could well be wrong. For decades, the tech industry has treated intelligence like a math problem, something that scales with more data, more compute, more optimization. But intelligence isn't a number you can make bigger. It's a relationship, one that's constantly being renegotiated. And in humans, it emerges from our interactions with each other. If we build AI on the wrong assumptions, we won't just waste billions of dollars and megawatts of energy, we'll steer an entire civilization toward the wrong future. Making a Mind is a podcast about how we can do it differently. We're building a new framework for understanding and building intelligence. It's grounded in what we actually know from cognitive science, developmental psychology, neuroscience, and even physics. That minds are not isolated engines of computation, but dynamic systems that evolve through connection, interaction, and learning. Each episode, you'll hear from scientists exploring how minds emerge, engineers building artificial ones, and thinkers trying to understand where this all leads. Our first guest is Kelsey Szot, product lead at Amazon's AGI lab, and one of the original founders of Adept, a startup that helped pioneer modern AI agents. Before that, she was at Google, scaling large language models with the inventors of the Transformer. Kelsey's story connects the early days of this technology to the moment we're living in now. Welcome to Making a Mind. Here's my conversation with Kelsey Szot. Today, we're going to talk about agent applications with Kelsey Szot, one of the original founders of Adept, who leads our product team now. Kelsey, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So I've talked to a lot of researchers and engineers about the building blocks of agents. We've talked about how we need to build agents that perceive like us, that plan and reason like us, that use tools reliably like us. And the theme that jumps out is that there's a lot that we can learn from understanding human intelligence.
100%.
So today I thought we could talk about the human part of that. So you're really interfacing with the customers and understanding how people are using these technologies. And I think also our listeners are just going to love to understand what it's been like to build a company in this space. So maybe we can start there. Why did you found Adept?
Yeah, sounds great. Happy to rewind the clock a little bit. It's particularly funny now that agents has become such a big term used in the industry and something that everyone's excited about. It's always fun looking back to the beginning when that was certainly not the case. So the way that I first started working on this space is I got introduced initially to LLMs back when I was at Google. So I was a PM working on TensorFlow. And one of the APIs on TensorFlow that I was responsible for was for distributed training. And at the time, many teams at Google were doing distributed training with maybe 8 GPUs, maybe 64, like along kind of that level of scale. And there was one team that was using like way more than that, 10, 100x, 1,000x more. And so as a PM, I was spending a lot of time speaking with users, understanding what was working with the API, what was not working. And I spent some time with this team and I was like, what on earth are you doing? This is crazy. And through that originally was this giant model team, as it was called at the time. It's since been revised to large and then large language models. But at the time, they were building these models that were way larger in scale than what we had seen before and really scaling up transformers for text-based tasks. So, classification, summarization, that type of thing at that time. And I was amazed by what we saw from a modeling point of view. I mean, we went from this whole paradigm of machine learning being I pick a task, I collect millions of examples for that task, I train a model purpose-built for that task, I refine it, I optimize it, I put it in production, and that's the thing I have. And at Google, we took this like pretty experimental model and we grabbed 100 teams around the company and said, hey, come try this out for like a week. And at the end of the week, you had half the teams with a better model than what they had spent years working on previously. So anyway, that was pretty incredible. Around the same time, this guy, David Lawan, was hired in from OpenAI, who had worked on GPT-2 and 3, and he was there to really come and lead this giant model effort and kind of take it to the next level. And we started working together on these models. And the thing we noticed that was just incredible was the ability for these models to just improve with scale in a way that was really staggering. David worked on some of the early image generation models that were, able to generate the image of an avocado chair just a few years prior. And then we're doing these incredible, like, photorealistic images. We're like, this is incredible. Like, what are other domains that we could apply this to? And the thing that really came to mind was that while these models were incredibly capable in the text space and they could even generate images, they couldn't actually do anything. Mm-hmm. So the sort of funny example I remember tossing around at the beginning that I think David had asked was, I could ask ChatGPT to order me a pizza, and it could tell me all about pizza. It could write me a sonnet about pepperoni. It could do all sorts of fun. It could draw me a picture of a pizza. But it couldn't actually get me any closer to taking that action, to achieving that goal. And having spent some time in consulting before I joined Google, I had just seen within the enterprise how messy knowledge work can be and how much time people spend really just wrestling with these systems that feel like they're working against us and not working for us. And how there's already tons of solutions to try to automate these processes that just fall short of what humans are capable of. So we thought this was a really exciting idea, and we're really intrigued by the possibility of a model that could use a computer in the same way a human could, and also like optimistic that the type of technology we had seen work really well for language could also work really well in this case. Because when coming back to what you're saying around, it's all coming back to like humans and how we operate in the world. Like when we use computers, there's so much intuitive background we have on what to do and how to react to the UI and how do you perform a simple action. And so the hypothesis was, what if we can train one of these models on all of these human demonstrations and screenshot data and try to give a model the same type of pattern recognition that you and I have when we use a computer. So that was the idea. It was crazy at the time because this did not exist in any way. I mean, now it's easy to talk about. Everyone's like, oh, of course, yes, all sounds great. But at the time, none of this was really known to be possible. So we started the company in January 2022. We thought it was going to take about 2 years to get to the first signs of life from a research perspective. Like, can we even do this? Is it even possible? And then we ended up getting there in about 8 months. So it happened much faster than we thought. And that was really the first moment. I remember all of us just gathering around someone on the team's like monitor, and we're all just watching as this model is like attempting to order a Frappuccino on Starbucks, and we're all like, oh my gosh, it's working. It's using the browser. So that was definitely sort of this landmark moment. And that's where the journey all began.
So you wanted to not just predict the next text token, but also the next action on computers. And obviously doing computer work, there's so much that we do that is not worthy of human cognition, human time, human energy. So this concept, we actually have this now, and there are a ton of companies that recognize the value, computer use agents. But the word agents weren't being used. Right. You were thinking about them in terms of what?
Yeah, it's so funny. I wish we had come up with that at the time because we were thinking about like, what do we name the company? How do we describe this to customers? I remember early conversations with enterprises, we'd have one slide that was like, has anyone heard of GPT-3? And it'd be like, maybe like 30% would raise hands. And then we'd be like, this is kind of like that. But instead of text, you're producing an action. So we called it an action transformer. And the room was like, what? Like, I don't think anyone had any idea what we were doing. Then ChatGPT came out after we had gotten our first prototype working. And that was definitely helpful because people could kind of understand more what we meant by what these large-scale models were capable of. But yeah, we definitely should have brought on like some marketing minds at the time and come up with agents because that seems to resonate much better now.
But even still, so I just read a recent blog about how we need to be thinking of different categories of agents. Like most people, when they think of agents, they're actually thinking of like librarians. And it's this original thing that you and David were noticing. They might bring together a lot of information, and that's great, that's useful, but they're not doing things. And so you've got the librarians versus the butlers.
Sure.
No, I'm not endorsing necessarily that sort of personification, but it gets the idea across that there is a difference, a meaningful difference between integrating and organizing information and actually taking actions on behalf of the user. And we're still, as an industry, kind of coming to terms with all of the implications that would have, not just for knowledge work, but for students in colleges that are figuring out how to invent the next generation of how things are done and how we do science. So there's just still so much, I think, education to be done about what you can do with these things.
And the thing that reminds me of too is that often when we think about any kind of like task or workflow or job to be done, even to use the librarian example, like there's often some of that can be handled just within the text modality or within, a single modality, the image modality. So if you think about a librarian, okay, let me pull together some information, let me recommend some sources for you. But then like almost any real life task or workflow includes some action-taking capabilities. Like in that example, sure, recommendations are one part of that role, but recommendations are only so useful insofar as you can take action on those recommendations. Another example I remember hearing from a customer early on was at the beginning, every company, ChatGPT came out, every company basically created this Gen AI budget, and they assigned hired a chief AI officer, or they assigned people on their team to go figure out what to do with Gen AI. I mean, I heard about customers who just demanded that everyone's 2023 roadmap included something to do with Gen AI. So people are just running around trying to figure out what to do with this. And most of the time, the use cases that really stuck at first were relatively simple text generation tasks, which makes total sense. I mean, these models are great at that type of thing.
Right.
I remember a customer describing how they were getting a lot of value out of using AI to generate job descriptions in kind of the tone and the format that they needed for their business. They were doing a lot of high volume seasonal hiring. But in that example, that's useful. But if you think about the job to be done in this case of actually hiring someone, generating the job description is one piece. But if you zoom out, what does even just thinking about posting the role, someone's got to go into the internal system to get the job code and then double check that with the Workday budget to make sure that these things are lining up, and then ensuring that it meets certain qualifications, and then posting that to social media. And there's all these steps along the way that typically involve wrangling these different systems and all that. And so I think at the beginning we really saw generative AI tackling very specific, here's one step in this process. And that's cool. It's a good starting point. But the way that we've always seen it is that end-to-end process is way more valuable than any single step. And that's a big reason why we started with the browser, because if you think about a task that's done on a computer, these days there's a lot of excitement around MCP and APIs and how do we take advantage of those things. And we share that excitement. But at the end of the day, a browser or a set of UIs can be used for everything.
Yes.
And so we really see that as the path towards end-to-end task completion. And then once we can do it through a browser, then there are certainly optimizations we can do to say, hey, this task, it's going to be much quicker to just call an API than it is to do 27 clicks to get something done, which is amazing. That's incredible to be able to speed things along and be more reliable. But overall, as humans, the way we use a computer is through UIs. And so that's been the way we've started, because that's the only way we get to this sort of end-to-end delivery of the thing that customers are really trying to do with this technology.
You kind of alluded to this, but in the same way that it's really hard to reverse engineer our intuitions of how we use computers, because we've co-evolved with them over the past decades, and we do things so intuitively now, it also seems like we have to not take for granted all of the human labor that goes into any one job to be done. There's just so many intricate components that go into that. So could you talk a little bit about early days at Adept? What did you have to do to make the light bulb go over the potential customers' heads so that they could really start to understand, this is how we could maybe build a prototype or make our workflows easier?
Yeah, totally. It's funny because at that time, we relied a lot on demos to just bring this to life of, imagine you could, at the time, we lovingly refer to our product shape at the time as the text box in the sky. It was terrible for many reasons, but our first demos, if you look back, they're all on YouTube now. I think you can see the little Adept orange text box, and you type in the thing you want and you hit enter and you pray it does something that you want. Of course, the demos are the times it works. And at that time, that was our primary way of showing users what to do. I remember when we were first showing these demos, we learned we had to actually clarify that it wasn't a person moving the mouse in the demo. Like you'd type in, find me a house in Houston on Redfin, and then you'd see the model like clicking and typing. And at first, customers did not get it. They're like, what's the magic here? You're just doing a task. And it's like, oh, no, we're not doing anything. We're just typing this in. And then it's like, hands up. So it's funny at that time, like no one really had this concept. Versus, fast forward to today, I think at this point, what we hear from customers is they are fully saturated with demos. They have seen a million demos. If you've been following the space at all, you've seen all kinds of demos using like new hardware devices, using really interesting UI patterns in product, integrating with other tools. I mean, there's so many agent demos and they're all amazing. They're really inspiring. But what we see customers running into today is like getting from a demo or even a prototype that works some of the time to something that is reliable enough to actually use.
Right.
And the thing that I think there's a unique challenge with agents that you don't see with something like text generation or more creative contexts like an image generator or video generation, which is that something that is 30% reliable or 60% reliable or even 80% reliable is 0% useful. If something gets you most of the way there and then it bungles the last step, it really doesn't matter. It's not good enough. And so the bar that we have for these types of applications is just much higher. And I think customers are really understanding this and internalizing this now as they go from, wow, this is so inspiring, I'm excited about this, to like, oh my gosh, but it's only working half the time. Where do I go from here?
I remember the moment back at Adept when we realized as a small startup, oh, there's this thing, the digital transformation with RPA. And that all of the enterprises have pivoted to that, but actually it's brittle and it's not serving the needs, or they're throwing so much money at it that it kind of defeats the purpose.
Yeah.
And so we thought, oh, well, maybe that's how we can frame things. And now I think a lot of customers have kind of internalized that framework, but that really just highlights that the reliability is the thing that we need to optimize for.
Totally. And it's interesting because when we talk to a lot of customers who are users of more like legacy RPA systems, and I remember implementing a lot of these back as a consultant to tackle some of these problems. I remember one customer, they're like, our rule of thumb is if a process has not changed in the last 10 years, it's a great fit. And the reason for that is, and customers have gotten extraordinary value out of these RPA legacy systems, despite the fact that they have no AI and they're just kind of rules-based software. Talking about, if you think back, I think many of these companies were started in 2003, like early products from that era are still useful today for processes that have not changed. The problem is like the minute you write, a very detailed process definition document that's 50 pages long, and then like one step changes, we hear customers saying like, I'm spending half my time just maintaining, not building new things. And then if you think about the scale of the web, you have a customer who maybe has automated one process for one SKU, but they have 10,000 SKUs, each with a slightly different process. Same general idea, but maybe different sites you have to visit. Or, I've automated something for the state of California, but now I need to automate it across the other 49 states. Or I've automated something for a single port, and I need the other 79 ports. Or one insurance company, I need all the other insurance companies. One hotel, all the other hotel brands. All of a sudden, just the sheer scale of what is needed here. As a human, we don't think twice about these things. Like if we have two, hotel websites that look slightly different and have different, names for different fields, we just, like, as people, we don't even worry about this. This is not at all a problem. But if you're trying to encode everything in really detailed rules-based software, that becomes a just insurmountable task. And so for a lot of our customers, we hear them starting with software-based solutions for very contained, kind of rigid workflows and getting lots of value out of that, but taking a look at like the vast array of things that they're having people spend time on today and pull their hair out over that are slightly too complex for what those systems are capable of. And that's what's exciting to me. I remember we had one customer in the healthcare space who had this team of people who all had specialized knowledge on the U.S. healthcare system, which is like extraordinarily complex, and specifically like requirements of different insurance carriers and how to navigate those systems. I think literally there was like associate's degrees that are given for this particular expertise this team had. And the head of the team was like, I have this incredible talent of people and they are completely overwhelmed by the volume of work they need to do, and they're spending like 80% of their time doing copy and paste. which is wild because there's so much expertise and so much that they could be applying to this type of task. And then when we sat down with the actual users, they're like, yeah, like I spend a lot of my day making sure I don't make typos.
Yeah.
And that's like not a super inspiring way to use all this expertise and bring that to bear. And so my hope is that in the context of the work that we're doing, we can take whatever is the thing, like anyone listening, imagine the thing that you like save to the end of the week or the end of the day or the end of the month that you just like dread doing. I would love it if nobody had to do that thing again. If we could take the updating your CRM or, you know, going through all your expenses or whatever that process is and just like take it off your plate. That is the type of just like ground level, you know, like base experience I think we can create with these agents. And that's only the beginning of what is possible here.
Right. So one of the big ideas in there is that AI can help generalize so that when there are changes to the tools that we're using, inevitably there will be changes. The web is constantly changing. We are able to accommodate that and not have to maintain or build a whole new system.
Yeah.
Generalization is a huge research problem, and we've talked about
100%.
that with the researchers and engineers who are doing a lot of innovative things to figure out how to get these models to generalize. Can you describe how some of the product and customer conversations that you have actually translate into the research that our team does?
Yeah, totally. I mean, generalization is a huge piece of this. And I remember early on, actually, we had, you know, the very first version of this that we had built in the first 8 months of the company. And at the time, there weren't really multimodal models available off the shelf. Multimodality was still relatively new. And so the first version of this we built used exclusively the text representation of a web page. And we went through several iterations of like what we should pass to the model as the observation of the page. So if you think about the way these agents work for the browser, they need some way to understand what's going on the screen so they can determine what action to take next. And at the beginning, we were basically taking, you know, the DOM of a site, the text representation, and it was like very long and it was noisy and we weren't getting great results. And then we tried, you know, only passing a piece of that. And we tried annotating, like, here are the clickable buttons in the observation. And we went through like observation V1, V2, V3, and every time we had to collect new data. And the goal was really to see this generalization that we were looking for. And ultimately, after we were trying, we were getting use cases from customers and trying out like, okay, if I can do this on one site, does it generalize to others without a change in the prompt? And ultimately, we came to the conclusion that this was not, at the time at least, possible with text-only capabilities. And that the way that we as people are able to generalize is because we look at the screen with our eyes and we're able to see in pixels what is going on. And that while every site is implemented differently and therefore has a different text representation, many sites have lots in common in terms of common UI elements and things you would recognize on a screen. And so that was kind of the trigger where we finally decided, all right, we need to throw out a lot of the work we've done so far and shift to multimodal models that are using screenshots. And over time, we've used a mix. You know, we've experimented with just screenshots and the DOM, just the DOM. And we've consistently seen that screenshots have given us the greatest level of generalization and reliability, which has been really interesting. Another kind of side note on that, which I also find interesting, is that for folks who have visual impairments, they often will use screen readers to use a computer. And the way these often work is basically by just reading the text representation of a page or like OCRing a screenshot and then just like spouting out everything that's on that page. And I remember speaking with this user who was using a screen reader and they were like, yeah, like if I'm looking for an article in the New York Times, the way I do that is I go to New York Times, if I don't know the URL, you know, at the outset, which who would, and then it reads the entire page to me and I wait until I hear the exact thing that I'm looking for and then I select it. And the other issue with this is sometimes you have sites where like a specific text representation of a button may not render correctly to a screen reader. And so this user was describing, like, I was ordering dinner last week and, you know, I was really hungry. I was trying to get something to my apartment, but the food delivery site, DoorDash or whatever it was, you know, the add to cart button was not working on my screen reader. So, like, there was no way for me to actually do that. And so I think, you know, that's a completely different angle on this problem, but you also see some of this pain with actual humans who are trying to apply, large amounts of intelligence toward this problem without having the view of the pixels and running into similar challenges. So hearing all this, we were like, okay, we need to take a fundamentally different approach on the research side and really rely on these screenshots in pixels as the foundation for being able to understand and determine the right action on these pages.
Right. So figuring out how to get these concepts, visual concepts, not just sort of representations from text to generalize is super important. We're also seeing patterns now that we're at Amazon, and there are a ton of similar customers, ton of internal customers. We're seeing patterns in the sorts of problems that we can add a lot of value in.
Yeah.
Even in the early versions of our agentic technology, there are low-hanging fruit for ways that we can add a lot of value. Can you talk about some of the use cases that you've seen, either internally or externally, and some of the patterns that you're observing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this whole working in this space has been very eye-opening for me. I think I got a taste of this when I worked in consulting and was just in these large enterprises and just getting a feel for what different types of work is like in different industries. But I think often as folks working in tech, we're very spoiled because we tend to, because folks in tech have the ability to build our own tools, we tend to have great tools that are designed really thoughtfully, that are very intuitive, they're built with the user in mind, and they're modern, and, they scale well and all these great things. And so I think it's sometimes easy for us to think, like, who would have a need for an agent in the context of their work? Like, if your tools are working well enough, then, what's the point? But when you look at these different industries, and we really see this across the board, but it tends to be the more fragmented the industry, the more need for this type of technology. You have these users who need to deal with these typically external sites, and there's just no way around it. Like, if you are trying to, understand the status of a mortgage on the Fannie Mae website, like, there is no, you can't build your own version of the Fannie Mae website that's really intuitive and delightful, right? If you're looking to check whether a piece of cargo has arrived at the port, of San Diego, like, you have to use that port's site. There's no way around it. And, like, I bet that port doesn't have a team of 50 engineers who's focused on optimizing that to be the greatest user experience. It's just not top of the priority queue. And so you run into so many instances that at first it was almost hard to believe. You're like, oh my gosh, you have, like, this person's job is, like, requiring dealing with all these systems. Like, it makes you just, like, it gives you a headache just hearing about it in some cases. But the pain is really real. So I think some of the patterns that we've heard, and these sound like very simple, but in practice they become very complex, are things like populating data in lots of different types of systems. One example of this we had recently as a customer that we featured here at Amazon, called Navan. They're a travel company. They have a team of travel agents. Every time someone books a travel reservation, there's like a hotel confirmation form you need to fill out to make sure that reservation has been booked properly and it's authorized and all that good stuff. Of course, every hotel chain has their own version of this form. And that form, has different field names for, some are combining first and last name, some call it a confirmation code, some it's a confirmation number, some it's, so you've got these just enough variety to make this difficult to automate with software, but sort of maximum frustration for a human who's having to just fill out these forms all day. So that's one example of this sort of, I need to take a central set of information in like a database or an internal tool and populate it in various places. That's one pattern. And then similarly, another pattern is I need to go fetch data from a bunch of different places. So an example of this might be in insurance, if you're generating quotes for a customer across a variety of different providers. Typically, every provider has their own portal. You're putting that client's information into, 10 different portals. You're generating this, and then you need to pull that all back into one central view. Today, a lot of that work is done manually. And in some cases, you have strategic decisions being made by certain companies to not make sites very, make it very easy to get data out of certain platforms, which totally makes sense. But then the experience for these customers can be very, very clunky and very, very painful.
Yeah.
And so we really see this across every industry, across most business functions. But what's been exciting is that the overall kind of archetypes and patterns of use cases are similar enough that we've been able to see some really exciting generalization where whether it is a hotel travel agent filling out a set of hotel forms or a highly specialized healthcare licensing specialist filling out a bunch of different applications for physicians.
Yeah.
Those are very different use cases, but when it comes down to the actual model capabilities, there's actually a lot in common. And so once we solve kind of the foundational building blocks of computer use, we're able to unlock these use cases that are quite diverse in nature.
Okay, so I want to invite you to speculate a little bit. We've been talking about sort of the jobs to be done, but now you're getting a little bit more into the humans who are doing these jobs and the pain points that they have and how their lives might change, how their work might change if they are able to use this technology. You've talked about things in terms of having a universal teammate for all knowledge workers, for all people. How do you imagine the future looking different? Maybe near-term future, and then if you want to venture out into the further term future.
Totally. I mean, the type of experience that I like to think about here is in every job I've had, there's always at least a few platforms or pieces of software that just don't feel super intuitive to me. And I'm constantly like Googling how to do this in this thing or like trying to troubleshoot like, how do I do this process? Or I know how to do this process. It's just very clunky. And in every one of those instances, there's some coworker I have who is just like a whiz at that thing. Like back when I was a consultant, there was someone on my team who was amazing at Excel. Any Excel problem, you'd like call her up day or night and she'd like jump in and help you figure out how to do something. And it feels like we've got these people who are just like this, incredible amount of data and experience using these tools and can therefore like help us become much better in these instances. I think what the future is going to look like here is basically imagine having that for every part of your job, or at least every part of your job that involves like wrestling with a computer system in the short term. And rather than having to spend hours of your time reading documentation on how to do something, you have at your fingertips an expert that is great at doing that, rote task of operating that piece of software. And so documentation becomes something that is for models, not for people. And rather than Googling how to do this and reading guides, I can just say, like, here's the thing that I want to do.
Yeah.
I remember actually when we first built the first version of this at Adept, because we were a really small team at the time and it was just kind of all hands on deck, I somehow ended up being the one to film the demos and get them ready for Twitter, which was a terrible idea because I had like zero social media experience. But I remember I had never like edited a video before. I knew nothing. And so I was literally Googling, like I think we had like the aspect ratio was wrong. So we had these like black bars and they weren't rendering really well on like the draft tweet. So I was Googling like remove black bars video. And then I would just get these like tutorials for like video editing tools. And I'm like, which tools should I even use? Then I'm like, okay, Final Cut Pro tutorial for dummies.
Dive in the deep end.
And yeah, exactly. I'm like, I guess this is what I have to use. And like, I had a really specific task in mind.
Yeah.
I didn't even care what tool it was that did it. But because I didn't have the knowledge of how to use those tools and operate and choose what was the best one for that scenario, it took way longer than it should have. I think in that world in the future, my hope is that all I have to do is articulate what I'm looking for, and then it's done. Like there's an agent that can choose the appropriate tool for that task and perform that task for me. I can provide input where needed, but instead of spending the like 3 hours it took to go fix those videos, I can move on and think about the next most important thing.
That, I think we would all agree, would be an incredible improvement in our quality of life, but it would also have cascading implications for how groups of people do work. Do you ever think about how like the human collaborations could change as a function of that?
Totally. I mean, going back to the example of what a consulting team does now versus what they did in the past.
Yeah.
I talked about my friend who was like an amazing, Excel whiz. There was a time, and I remember talking to, older, more tenured folks at McKinsey back when I was working there about this, where as an analyst at a consulting firm, most of your job was doing like by hand accounting calculations, on a sheet of paper and drawing slides using literally like stencils. Like there was a stencil that was given to you and you would hand draw everything. And it's interesting hearing about that time because the thing you immediately think of is like, wow, that was a lot of, manual work. And now we have Excel, which is able to do basically all of that work in a matter of minutes rather than a matter of days. That's like the typical narrative you hear about this type of thing. We invent tools and then we have all this leverage on our time. And like, that's certainly true in that scenario. But the thing that struck me most actually about hearing about the differences between that job then versus when it was my first job, a decade ago, was the type of collaboration that happened on teams was so different.
Yeah.
Because at that time, sure, there was, conversations about strategy and, what we were going to do and how we were going to solve a client's problem. But so much time was spent just like running the numbers and figuring out how to communicate it, and just like the rote work required to do that well took up so much time, particularly of folks at a more junior level, that their just bandwidth to engage on strategic topics was much lower.
More siloed.
Versus totally. Fast forward to, today it's probably even more extreme, but when I worked in this job, I spent most of my time problem solving how we, based on these results, what do we do? How is the client going to increase revenue or whatever the problem was? Working with senior people, working with clients, having that hands-on experience.
Yeah.
And then like in the evenings from 7 to midnight, I did my modeling and slides and all this stuff. But the bulk of my time was not that. And I think that like the level of collaboration and the percentage of time I spent talking to another person was probably significantly higher than what you might have seen a few decades ago in the same exact role. And so that's one thing I'm excited about. As we see jobs evolve and change with these new types of tools, is to see more of collaboration and sort of bringing out the best in each other and being able to bounce ideas off people, which I think is so much more effective than just like going into a room and thinking about something really hard. And I'm hoping that as we are able to free up some of this time that we're currently spending on these tasks that nobody really wants to do, we're able to just take more time to collaborate and empathize and understand, and that will ultimately get us better results across all sorts of areas.
So people will be able to collaborate better with other people and will sleep more.
Yes, yes, that would also be a great side effect here.
I also think a lot about people working with people more. And I think that there are other ways in which it's not just more time, but the thoughts that we are having, we have experts at our fingertips that can do things for us so that we're freed up to be more creative and strategic, but also they will have context on the whole team.
Yeah.
And so we have a better, we can tap into that context. We can know, oh, Kelsey's thinking about this problem and using these tools, or her agent is using these tools. I've been thinking about this thing. This is the best level of abstraction to link our minds together and problem solve. So I have this sort of visualization in my mind where there's this like collection of agents that are personalized to all of us, and they're like these rising tides where we're able to just connect with each other, with other people at a higher level, and communicate and all of the things that really feel good about work and learning.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's before I got into this space as a builder, I spent some time with a think tank thinking about the impact of automation and AI on jobs and how does this break down. And this was, several years ago, but I remember at the time doing this exercise where we looked at every job defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and understood through, time studies and other literature that was available, what are the activities involved in that job? And then basically for each of those activities, what % of them is automatable? What is addressable by AI? There have been a bunch of studies done since then, but all have kind of a similar conclusion. That particular study at the time, the conclusion was, I think it was almost 0% of jobs were 100% automatable.
Yeah.
I think there were like a handful. And at the same time, almost 0% of jobs were 0% automatable. So the extremes were very rare. But 2/3 of jobs were at least 30% automatable. And I think the conclusion there was more so than, my job is going to completely change or it's going away and I have to get something totally new. There is a very real change we can expect here where like 1/3 of our job on average is likely to look pretty significantly different.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really exciting proposition. It also means that when I think about, my son and future generations and what is going to be really important for them to learn as they enter this workforce, that adaptability is going to be so critical because you're going to have to be constantly learning, retooling yourself, adapting to change in a way that I think has been increasing over time, but will just continue to increase in that way. And being able to take advantage of these new tools, take advantage of the opportunity to collaborate more, all of that is going to be change. And so it'll be really important that all of us kind of have that mindset of, the most important thing to learn is how to learn.
Totally.
And that's going to be like the crucial thing, I think, when we think about, broader things like education and, workforce planning and how do we equip folks to be successful in this new age.
And similar for the agents. One of the big research problems is meta learning. In order to generalize and continually learn and all of that, you have to learn how to learn, and that's how they're going to be useful to us and sort of aligned with the things that we care about. So you're kind of painting this story of continuation, both from the data that you shared, also from your personal experiences. You also have an interest and a background in the history of computers.
Yes.
Do you think about this coming change where these technologies are starting to be adopted en masse, changing our work, as being one of continuity, or do you see it more as an inflection point?
That's a great question. It's funny, I sometimes will reflect on this. I attended Stanford in my undergrad, and so we were in Silicon Valley. There was this course that I took as a freshman and then ended up TAing a few times. There was this seminar about, it was called Great Ideas in Computer Science, and it was basically about these inflection points where a new technology was invented and it really changed the course of the field. Computer science is really interesting in that we've had so many of these in a short period of time. And so I often, as we're developing this technology, think about like the Computer History Museum, which I highly recommend folks visit, and like what the exhibits are there and what the exhibits will be looking back on this time in the future. And I absolutely think that this is a transformative technology. I think there was a lot of hype when ChatGPT first came out of like, wow, this is the thing that's going to change everything. And I think certainly the transformer and the ability for large-scale models to get us the generative capabilities we're seeing now is transformative, and particularly in the minds of the public has been incredibly transformative. But I think it's just the beginning of what's to come. And I really think the overall impact of agents and these models that can take action, the impact on the way we live and work is going to far surpass what we've seen so far with primarily, chat-based interfaces. I think you already hear from people like, oh yeah, I use this every day and it changes the way I approach certain problems. I think that is only the beginning of what we're going to see here. And I absolutely think we're going to look back on this as like one of the key defining technologies of this field. And that's really exciting and humbling to think about, that like we get the opportunity to work on this every day is really cool, particularly thinking about the landscape of all the incredible innovation that has happened here. And now we're the ones who get to take a look at this like on the frontier, kind of push the bounds of what's possible, and then also take what's coming out of this incredible research and put it into the hands of users. And that's a really exciting place to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel so lucky to be at the epicenter of this inflection point. You mentioned, chatbots have been very useful, maybe transformative, but really they're just the starting point. Do you spend a lot of time thinking about the interfaces, or is that just still this big problem that we'll have to kind of see how that changes?
Great question. I have more questions than answers, I would say. I do think that agents pose a really interesting question that we're just starting to see folks grapple with. In the example I gave earlier around, me struggling to figure out how to edit this video, I think that's a good one to kind of illustrate the difference I expect we'll see in how people engage with software. I mean, today, folks design software with a set of features and functionality, and they brand that software, and typically it's, something that you download and then you use, or you visit a particular URL and you interact with that tool. But as it becomes easier and easier to use bits and pieces of different tools, to string together different pieces of a workflow using an agent, I think there are really interesting questions that come up, like what is the right way to think about bundling software? Like what types of features need to be included? Is it going really deep on one area? Or is it putting together a set of features that really span like an end-to-end task? I think that's something that the field has grappled with for a long time, and I think it's a really interesting question in the context of agents. I think from an interface perspective also, I would be really surprised if in the future you open a laptop and the thing you see is like all your applications. that feels like it's not going to be around for long. You might not even know what application is being used under the hood to complete a task. And that's obviously very different from the world we live in today. And then even when we think about UIs, I think visualization will continue to be critical. I think for a while there was this popular narrative that, the UI, the GUI is dead and it's all going to be chat. I just don't believe that's true. I think as humans, we're very visual creatures, and that really allows us to get to more depth of reasoning and understanding and creativity. But I do think the nature of common GUI patterns is almost certainly going to change. I mean, when you look at average website, so much of the real estate on a page is dedicated towards navigation. You've got menus that, maybe nest and hover, and there's all these kind of pointers to indicate where you should go. If in time you have agents doing most of that navigation and you're just consuming, one page, then all you need is enough for an agent to know what to do. You no longer need a human to be able to perform all of those navigation steps. So anyway, all of these are things that I think about. I don't know what the answer will be, but I'm really excited to see.
Yeah, and that also is another example of a parallel, I think, with the evolution of our own cognition. So modules are one of the amazing ways that we were able to divide up problem solving in the environment. You see this across animal forms. And you described these bundles of UIs and software packages, and being able to knit them together to simplify, that's ultimately one of the things that made us human, is that, language knit together all of these different modules, and we are able to think about other minds rather than all of the sort of individual behaviors. We represent information at a higher level of abstraction. And I think that that's the direction that we're moving in. This is also just history of computing.
Totally. It's also so funny, this is on a slightly different note, but we talked earlier about how one of the reasons we were really excited to start Adept and go try this out was we had seen such incredible advances in other domains where with additional scale, models just became so much better.
Yeah.
And it's been really neat to see that in the context of agents and computer use, because it's very easy to relate to these differences. I think when I look at what an image generating model can do today, it's just so far beyond my own capabilities that I can't even really comprehend. I could never create this incredible imagery that these folks are creating. When I think about computer use, though, it is very relatable. At the beginning, even a year ago or a year and a half ago, when we had these models, we were really trying to get them working reliably and be able to click where you want to click and scroll the right number of times. And these sound simple, but they're very hard technical and research problems, as you've talked about with other folks. But I remember at the beginning, the thing it felt like was having, if I could transport someone from the 1800s to today, and I had to describe to them how to, order a burger on DoorDash, what would that look like? Because literally we were talking to this model and saying okay, click settings. It looks like a gear. It's in the top right. It's the second icon from the right. And sometimes we'd even have to tell the model, do not click the question mark. You just have these models be oh, maybe it's this. And it's no, you had to be very, very specific with what you wanted. And then now it's much more the way I would tell you how to do something, right?
Yeah.
Obviously the capabilities are still relatively limited, but I don't have to go into all of that detail to do something simple like open the settings page. And so it's interesting too, this is a fun domain to work on because it feels very relatable. And as a person, you have so much experience using computers, and you've gone through this own evolution throughout your life of how should I use this and how should I communicate with this? I laugh, I was visiting my grandma recently, and we got her an Alexa device. And I feel our generation, we've internalized this new language for talking to, Google or ChatGPT, I think has changed this to some extent, but or voice devices where it's very truncated. It's tell me the weather, or, if I'm Googling a search term, it's typically a 2-word representation of what I want. My grandmother is oh, hi there, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I was wondering, maybe could you tell me what the weather might be tomorrow? And that's so different from what I would say to one of these devices. So it'll be interesting, too, to see how some of these interaction patterns change with agents over time, where I think we're starting from a place where a lot of people are using very sort of brief, descriptions, very to the point. But just the whole way we think about this communication, it's going to be fascinating the way all this thing.
And it just happens organically. This is what people do. We co-evolve with these technologies, and then we can't even remember what it was like 5-10 years ago when we did things differently. It's hard to empathize with, but this is essentially what makes us human. We invent technologies, we co-evolve with them. We never arrive somewhere. It's just like never ending. We will continue to then build upon the things that we are co-evolving with today. So last question, this is what I ask everybody. What are you personally most excited about using AI for? What application do you think will be most useful for you?
There's a lot, I feel like, in the context of like my day-to-day work life that has been already heavily optimized. But there's a lot of things that I'm realizing personally as a parent that are not heavily optimized. So one example here is we like order diapers for my son to come on a weekly basis because his size is changing frequently at this stage. And the platform for doing that is like impossible to figure out. So that's one thing that I've already automated with Nova Act. I'm like, please handle this for me. It like asks me what size I want and if I need to change, what's in the order, that type of thing. So I think what I'm actually most excited about is things on like the life admin side of things. I think on the work side, I see incredible opportunity for impact in these like very fragmented spaces where folks are really dealing with like this burden of interacting with these systems. I personally am very lucky that I don't feel as much of that compared to many folks. But in my personal life, there's all sorts of examples like that I'm really excited to get some help with.
Yes, I think a lot of folks would agree with you on that.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.